In the December rocket report, Sergeant Nualis informed us of the passing of General Yeager and some of his accomplishments. Many of us read biographies posted in December after his passing. Yeager himself published an autobiography of about 500 pages that I read back in the 1990s. So instead of another biography of Chuck Yeager, we're taking a test. But not the Yeager test many of you have already passed. We're taking a quiz. But not a normal quiz, where there's one true answer and the rest are false. Tonight, we are taking the Yeager UnQuiz. I'm going to ask you which statement is false because so many amazing stories about Yeager's experiences are actually true. We're going to start with a word of caution. Do not attempt any of these things yourself. Chuck Yeager was a bold pilot who survived to be an old pilot because he knew everything about his aircraft, he stayed calm under pressure, and he had a whole lot of luck. So here we go. Which of these conflicts did Chuck Yeager not serve in? Pick a number.
4. 4.
3.
1.
1.
I hear 3s, 4s, and 1s.
4.
But no 2s. That's interesting. Yeager's World War II exploits in his P-51 Mustang are pretty well known, and we'll come back to those later. He did not serve in Korea during the war, but he did fly the jet fighters used by both sides, our P-80 Shooting Star and the F-86 Sabre, and the Soviet-built MiG-15. The U.S. Air Force offered a $100,000 reward to the first pilot who defected from Korea with a MiG-15 for the U.S. to study. That's about $1 million today. This top-secret bounty was actually called Operation Moolah, that's the real name, and it was approved on April 1st, 1953. Yep, April Fool's Day. When a North Korean pilot defected and landed his MiG-15 in South Korea in late 1953, Yeager and another Air Force test pilot came to Okinawa to fly it and report how it compared to UN aircraft. One thing they learned is it was not controllable near the speed of sound because it used elevators instead of a full flying tail like the X-1. During the Vietnam War, Yeager commanded the 405th Fighter Wing in the Philippines, which included 2 squadrons of B-57 bombers. He flew over 400 hours of combat time over Vietnam in 127 missions while training bomber pilots. The Cold War was a span of about 45 years, and Yeager served about half of that period. For instance, in 1968, he commanded the 4th Tactical Fighter Wing deployed to South Korea with F-4 Phantoms. Which statement is false? Before World War II, Chuck Yeager, pick a number.
2.
3. 3.
3.
1.
I hear 2s and 3s. Actually, Chuck Yeager never saw a plane on the ground before age of 18 and just didn't think much about them. He had no interest in flying when he joined the Army. He was a gifted mechanic, which got him assigned to be an aircraft mechanic. One day after he worked on an AT-11 Kansan, the pilot invited him to ride along while he checked it out. And he did get airsick on his first flight in an airplane. After Pearl Harbor, they relaxed the requirements for pilots to have a college education, and his 2010 vision and excellent hand-eye coordination got him into the pilot training program. Chuck was training on the P-39 in Nevada one day, where he'd gotten to know some local sheep ranchers and would sometimes help herd their sheep by buzzing the flock. One time he went a bit too low and clipped a small tree with his left wing. That did get him grounded for a week. On a training flight, the P-39 he was flying, the engine caught fire, and Yeager had to bail out pretty low. He fractured his back, but did return to flying after he healed up. The P-39 Airacobra is an interesting beast. It was developed before World War II as a short-range ground attack plane. They wanted lots of firepower, but mounting all those weapons meant lots of recoil kicking your aim around. Some machine guns were mounted low on the wings, and others are mounted high above the prop to try to balance out the recoil. And they wanted a 37 millimeter cannon firing through the center. That's a 1.5-inch diameter round. And here's how they did it. The nose of this airplane is a cannon and its ammunition. The engine is actually behind the pilot, and the drive shaft runs between his feet. The center of mass is pretty far back, and when you fire off ammunition, that moves it even farther back. Along with the small wings, this makes it very tricky for new pilots to handle. It couldn't fly fast or high enough to be an effective air-to-air fighter, but it could turn on a dime at low speed and altitude. Guess that makes it pretty good for herding sheep, but not as good for trimming trees. Which statement is false? 1944, after Chuck Yeager bailed out of his P-51 over German-occupied France. Pick a number.
2.
2. 2.
2.
He actually did use a tree to cushion his fall. Yeager knew that the Germans in the air might shoot at him under his parachute, and the Germans on the ground would look for where his chute landed. So he fell from 18,000 feet down to 8,000 before he opened his chute. One German fighter did dive at him, but it was shot down by a P-51 that was chasing it. His report says that he landed in a forest clearing with a 20-foot sapling, so he grabbed it on the way down, and it bent over and swung him onto the ground. Yeager made his way through those woods until he met some French folks who brought him to the French resistance. And then it took a few weeks to move him through German-held territory to the mountains between France and Spain. During those weeks, he kept busy by helping them resist the German army on the ground. You see, Chuck's dad back in West Virginia was a gas driller, and that's where Chuck learned to work on all the machinery of his father's job and also learned about explosives. So Chuck Yeager taught the French resistance how to set their fuses when they demolished bridges the Germans were using to move troops and supplies through France. He did not spend any time in a German POW camp, but it was pretty close. He was partnered with a B-24 navigator who'd also been shot down, and they climbed the mountains for 4 days, till they stopped to rest in an empty cabin, and the navigator hung his wet socks outside the cabin to dry. A German patrol happened along, saw those GI socks hanging out, and started shooting into the cabin. Both of them jumped out the back window, but the navigator had been hit. Chuck loaded him onto a log sled, and they escaped the Germans by sledding down the mountain until they landed in a stream. Yeager tended the navigator's wound as best he could, then loaded him onto the sled again and dragged him back up the mountain. After they came down the other side in Spain, Yeager was returned to England and later found out that navigator survived the war. Now, at that time, pilots who were helped by resistance groups weren't allowed to return to combat in the same theater, because if they were later captured, they could reveal information about the resistance. But Yeager wanted back into the action, and he took his appeal all the way up to the Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower of Abilene, Kansas. On his way to make his case to Eisenhower, he had to take cover from a V-1 buzz bomb attack. This was probably the first time he'd ever heard a jet engine. When he met Eisenhower, Yeager argued that the Allies were already in France and the resistance was now openly fighting the Nazis, so they weren't a secret anymore. Eisenhower agreed and gave the order to allow Yeager to return to combat in Europe. So he was, in fact, the first pilot to return to combat duty after being shot down. So which statement is false? During World War II, Chuck Yeager, pick a number.
3.
3.
3.
4.
4.
4.
4.
Lots of 3s and 4s. Yeager did not, in fact, down an enemy plane with his P-51's drop tank. But in one day, he shot down 4 Focke-Wulf 190s. On another day, he shot down 5 Messerschmitt 109s. He was leading his squadron on that day out ahead of a bomber group and spotted 24 Me 109s forming up ahead of them. Since the P-51s were coming out of the sun, the Me 109s either didn't see them or thought they were friendly because Yeager's squadron was able to close up behind them to firing range. When he opened fire on the first one, it rolled into its wingman and both pilots bailed out. He shot down one enemy plane with another. He closed in on that formation and hit the third one from behind at about 600 yards before the formation broke up into a dogfight. He hit number 4 with a deflection shot, which then caught fire and went into a spin. But number 4's wingman was trying to get behind him by throttling back, so Chuck kicked right rudder to aim directly at him and then rolled left and pulled a 6G turn to get a leading shot from 300 yards and put a burst into his tail. Number 5 rolled over a few times and the pilot bailed out, making Chuck Yeager an ace in a day. Late 1944, they'd figured out some Messerschmitt 262 jet fighters were working out of a field in Bremen, Germany. Yeager's squadron was on patrol and spotted 5 Me 262s, and they chased to attack. The Messerschmitts and the Mustangs played hide-and-seek in the clouds, and Yeager took shots at a couple of different jets, but both times they just accelerated out of range instead of turning to engage. Yeager had lost sight of the enemy fighters and his own squadron in the clouds, so he was alone when he found the airfield and spotted a lone Me 262 very low and slow approaching to land. Yeager dove down to 500 feet at 500 miles per hour through flak to fire one burst into it before he was forced to pull away by the heavy flak. He looked back and saw that 262 crash short of the runway. By the end of World War II, Yeager was credited with 12 kills, including 1 jet fighter. So which statement is false? Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier. Pick a number.
4.
4.
2.
4.
2.
4.
4.
4 is correct. 4 is correct because there was no wind tunnel data for the transonic region. No one had figured out how to make a wind tunnel test in that at that speed region. So they were still flying into the unknown. He did make his record-setting flight 1 month after the creation of the U.S. Air Force. He was, of course, dropped from a bomber. They had to remove large sections of that B-29 fuselage in Bombay to sling the X-1 inside it, and then add a steel longitudinal spar to make up for the lost structural integrity. And you can see there the underside of the bomber was painted black to reduce the glare and give the X-1 pilots a visual reference. Yeager broke the sound barrier on October 14, but the flight was classified at the time to keep the secret of the X-1 design. It wasn't until mid-1948 that the flight was declassified and Yeager became publicly known as the fastest man alive and won numerous aviation awards. So which one is false? Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier. Pick a number.
1.
2.
2.
2.
2.
2.
2.
Saw the movie.
2 is correct. The Bell Corporation built the X-1, and Bell's chief test pilot was demanding a $150,000 bonus if he broke the sound barrier. That's about $1.75 million now. So the X-1 was turned over to the Air Force to continue testing. Chuck Yeager was paid about $250 per month by the Air Force at the time. There was no bonus for breaking the sound barrier. And of course, he did it in a rocket-powered plane without an ejection seat that glided to a high-speed one-shot landing and made a terrible glider that landed at over 100 miles per hour. He also did it with broken ribs, because 2 days before this scheduled flight, he was thrown from a horse Instead of reporting to the flight surgeon, who would have grounded him, he went to a local doctor who told him his ribs were broken and taped him up. The problem was, it takes both hands to crank the lever to lock the hatch of the X-1 that you can see there at the lower right. So his buddy, Jack Ridley, who was also a test pilot, cut off a broom handle, and Yeager used that to close the hatch with one arm. And he also made that flight using shampoo to de-ice the windshield because they just found that it worked better than the chemical the Air Force provided.
Also in the movie.
Which statement is false? 1953, Chuck Yeager broke Mach 2 and level flight. Pick a number.
One.
All I'm hearing is one.
3.
2.
One was correct, but we'll get back to that. The NACA had the Douglas Skyrocket, breaking speed records, and the Air Force had the Bell X-1A, which carried more fuel than the X-1. 1 month before the 50th anniversary of the Wright brothers' flight, NASA pilot Scott Crossfield just barely broke Mach 2 in a dive and was hailed as the fastest man alive. Chuck Yeager kicked the X-1 program into high gear, trying to break that record before the anniversary, in what he called Operation NASA Weep. Yeager flew the X-1A to 74,000 feet and 2.5 times the speed of sound. And then the plane suddenly yawed and then snapped around all 3 axes, about 600 degrees per second for 8 or 9 Gs. His helmet hit the canopy hard enough to break the pressure seal, which caused his pressure suit to inflate and his visor to fog over. After falling about 50,000 feet in 50 seconds, he did not eject because the X-1A didn't have an ejection seat. So all he could do was hang on and ride it down. Around 25,000 feet, he was able to recover from that spin and bring it back for a normal landing. And all that happened in the middle of a fairly normal day for Chuck. He'd been up at 0400 to hunt ducks, then he attended the flight briefing, flew the rocket plane up, spun it back down, got home at 16:30, and then drove 2.5 hours to Los Angeles to give a speech to the Navy League, which is like the Air Force Association. And he was back home again by 02:30. Which one is false? In the 1960s, Chuck Yeager, pick a number.
2. 1.
1.
1.
1.
1.
1.
One is correct. He did not apply to be an astronaut because he wasn't qualified since he only had a high school education. And he was not interested in being spam in a can. You see, in the early 60s, astronauts rode rockets up and parachutes down, and they had very little control over their flight. We sent a chimpanzee named Ham into space before we risked sending a human. And the Air Force pilots joked that they didn't want to climb out of that can smelling like ham. In the 60s, Yeager was commandant of the Air Force Aerospace Research Pilot School, where they did train military pilots for the dinosaur and mole programs. The Manned Orbiting Laboratory was designed as a reconnaissance observatory based on Gemini program hardware, where astronauts would use a huge telescope to spy on the Russians. Vandenberg Air Force Base, Space Launch Complex Number 6, was constructed to launch these into polar orbit. And that's why we have a West Coast heavy launch complex, even though the MOL program was canceled. The Dinosaur was a military spaceplane development program. Planned missions included reconnaissance, bombing, space rescue, satellite maintenance, or space interceptor. Neil Armstrong was selected as one of the test pilots for the program. In the mid-60s, military space programs were canceled and astronauts were reassigned to NASA. But the dinosaur research was scaled up later as part of the Space Shuttle program. One of the test programs at the Aerospace Research School was an F-104 Starfighter with a 6,000-pound thrust rocket mounted in its tail. They also extended the wings and nose and added rocket impulse thrusters. The pilots wore pressure suits, kind of like spacesuits, and the flight profile would light the afterburner in level flight at 35,000 feet, then at Mach 2, pull up and light the rocket. Then you shut off your jet engine at about 80,000 feet and ride a ballistic trajectory above 100,000 feet and use the thrusters to simulate maneuvering in space. Now consider, the F-104 was a difficult aircraft to fly even before adding a rocket that shifted the center of mass backward. On one of these test flights, Yeager came out over the top at 104,000 feet, but the Starfighter would not pitch down. Instead of arcing over, it came down in a flat spin, and without airflow into the turbine, he couldn't restart the jet to regain control. He spun down more than 90,000 feet before ejecting, which is supposed to kick the seat up on a little rocket, and then the chute opens while falling, and the seat drops away. But the plane, in a flat spin, was moving straight down about the same speed the ejection seat kicked up. So Chuck was hanging there weightless when the seat separated, tumbled, and hit him in the face with its rocket nozzle, which cracked open his helmet and ignited the oxygen inside his pressure suit. Now, Chuck always learned as much as possible about any equipment he used and stayed calm in an emergency. So he remembered that when you open the helmet visor, a valve stops the flow of oxygen in the suit. So while he's parachuting down with his suit on fire, he used one hand to push the visor release button and the other hand to hold the visor open until he hit the ground, which saved his life. He was burned in this accident, but he returned to flight status just 6 weeks later. And yes, Yeager did fly a bathtub. NASA had this bathtub glider, and Yeager wanted to know if it would be a useful trainer for his pilots. The M2F1 was a lifting body concept for a wingless glider that might make an effective re-entry vehicle, because its shape would provide aerodynamic lift and control while shedding speed so it didn't burn up. Before they towed this glider with a plane, they tested it at lower speeds by towing it with a souped-up Pontiac Bonneville that they tuned themselves. This research also made its way into the Space Shuttle program, and this is why the Space Shuttle had a blunt nose. Speaking of the movie, which statement is false? Tom Wolfe wrote a book, The Right Stuff, which was made into a movie in 1983. The first third of the movie is mostly about Chuck Yeager. Chuck Yeager himself, pick a number.
Four.
4.
4.
4.
Folks have been paying attention. Now, to be clear, this refers to the 1983 movie, not the 2020 series. You can see Chuck as Fred the bartender in a couple of scenes in the movie. He even has some lines. Yeager had a lot of input in making sure they got all the aircraft right, though he makes the point that this film is entertainment, it is not a documentary. And he was flying some of the aircraft you see in various scenes of the movie. But he never said he had the right stuff. He didn't believe in that, and he got tired of people asking him about it. From the quote we saw earlier, he trusted experience, knowing your equipment, and luck. Which statement is false? Chuck Yeager, pick a number.
1.
3.
2.
3.
3.
As it happened, Chuck never reported a UFO sighting. When reporters asked him if he ever saw one, he said, "No, I don't drink before I fly." Yeager actually named at least 4 airplanes after his wartime sweetheart. The Glamorous Glenn was the P-51 that was shot down over France. When he returned to duty, he named his new P-51C Glamorous Glenn II at the upper right, which was soon replaced by a P-51D named Glamorous Glenn III. Chuck married Glennis after returning from World War II in early 1945, and when he broke the sound barrier, the X-1 he flew was named Glamorous Glennis. A year after he retired in 1975, Congress awarded General Yeager with a silver medal which was presented by President Gerald Ford. This is equivalent to a non-combat Medal of Honor, and the citation reads in part, quote, "As pilot of the XS-1 research aircraft, Yeager advanced aerospace science a quantum leap by proving that an aircraft could be flown at supersonic speeds. He dispelled for all time the mythical sound barrier and set the stage for unprecedented aviation advancement," end quote. This is the only peacetime congressional medal awarded in the history of the United States. In 1962, Neil Armstrong was a test pilot for the X-15 rocket plane pictured here. NASA had asked Yeager whether a certain dry lake was dry enough for them to land on if they had an emergency with the X-15 that day. Yeager said no, it rained up there recently, it's too wet. NASA asked if he'd go and check it out with one of their pilots. So Armstrong flew Yeager in a T-33 Shooting Star, there on the right, up to that lake. Armstrong said it looks dry enough. Yeager said, nope, it's too wet. Armstrong tried it anyway, and as soon as they touched down, the gear started dragging in the mud. Full power didn't make any difference. They rolled to a stop in the mud and had to shut down the engine. So there they were, late afternoon in the high desert where a helicopter wouldn't reach them before dark, in the middle of a lake miles across that's too muddy for another plane to land on. Chuck got on the radio and called a C-47 that was working nearby. He says, "We need you to land on the edge of this dry lake where it's less muddy, but do not stop rolling so you don't get stuck." So Chuck Yeager and Neil Armstrong hiked across this muddy lake bed and then ran to jump into a cargo plane to catch a ride back to base. And that was the only time Armstrong and Yeager ever flew together. Which of these is false? After retiring from the Air Force, Chuck Yeager, pick a number.
1.
1.
1.
1.
1.
This one was kind of a math problem, but we'll get to why in a minute. Chuck Yeager was 89 years old for the 65th anniversary of breaking the sound barrier, and on that day he rode an F-15 as a passenger. But he was 74 years old when he did pilot an F-15 supersonic for the 50th anniversary of his breaking the sound barrier. You can see the one he flew there at the upper left, named Glamorous Glennis, and the reception he got as a passenger there at the lower right. He drove the pace car for the Indianapolis 500 in 1986 and 1988. He also led a 4-ship formation of P-51 Mustangs in a flyover in 1994. Now, some of us remember Yeager and all those commercials for AC Delco and magazine ads for Timex watches. He made GM commercials in the 80s where he told people to buckle up because that was not mandatory at the time. And he did make promotional videos for Northrop to help them sell F-20 Tiger Shark jet fighters. He also made a public service announcement for NASA with John Madden, telling people about search and rescue satellites. Around 1990, a little company called Electronic Arts asked Yeager to help them make video games. Chuck Yeager's advanced flight trainer let you test fly aircraft from a Cessna 172 to the SR-71 Blackbird. And Chuck Yeager's Air Combat simulated battles from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Chuck himself would give you the historical context for the battle and explain which tactics to use against various aircraft. He'd even call out advice during the missions, and he chewed you out if you failed. You can see there at the top, that's a sorry way to land an airplane. And Yeager did fly people at air shows for decades. For 10 years, he was chairman of the Young Eagles program, and they had a goal to give 1 million kids airplane rides before the 100th anniversary of the Wright brothers' flight. Chuck Yeager was 80 years old when he flew the 1,000th Young Eagle on December 17, 2003 at Maxwell Air Force Base. In 1990, Yeager was asked his advice for kids trying to find their way in life. He said, "Do something you like. Don't worry about the paycheck. Adjust your lifestyle to fit your income. Everyone I've ever met who enjoyed their job was good at it. And don't be too narrow in your goals or you might miss opportunities." This has been the Yeager UnQuiz. Do we have any questions?
No question, Sean. Just thanks for putting this all together. It's very interesting.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Hope you found it educational and maybe a little entertaining.
We thank everybody for joining in.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.